I'm Matt Daneman with Communications Daily, and I am here to ask questions of people far smarter than me. But we'll start with the introductions. We won't go way into bios because you've got them right there in front of you. Directly to my left and to your right is Michael Purdy, Google's Senior Counsel. Beyond that is Christina Mason, Wireless ISP Association Vice President of Government Affairs. Steve Sharkey, T-Mobile's Vice President of Government Affairs, Technology, and Engineering Policy. Long one. And Jonathan Adelstein, Wireless Infrastructure Association President and also former FCC Commissioner, 2002-2009. We're here to talk about sort of the role of C-band in 5G and a variety of related sort of issues. And I'm going to sort of throw out that question and go down the road really quickly, both for opening comments, but also to ask, why are we talking about C-band specifically? I mean, there's obviously a need for mid-band spectrum for 5G. That's been well documented and been talked about ad nauseum. But why specifically C-band, and how does C-band as a spectrum band for 5G compared to the complexities and the issues of other mid-band spectrums like 3.5 gigahertz? How does this fit in and compare and contrast? And Michael, I'll kick it off to you.
Sure. I'll try to keep this brief. So Google's kind of in a unique position here in that we come at this from a slightly different perspective than some of the other stakeholders. Our driving principles here, obviously internet and internet connectivity is critical for our business. We're an internet company, duh. So C-band is critical for 5G. That is the basis of our interest. Specifically, we're trying to achieve two goals, or we would like to see two outcomes. We'd like to see as much clearing as possible in the band for flexible use, provided that there's protection for the existing use cases. We'd also, and I think WISPA is going to echo this, we'd also like to see immediate sharing in the repacked portion of the band for point to multi-point wireless networks. We come at this with a degree of expertise. We're a leader in CBRS and the Spectrum Access System. In fact, I'm the product counsel for the Spectrum Access System. And to your point about why C-band, why are we discussing it? Well, for us, CBRS is on the verge of what we believe is going to be a great success. The spectral environment in CBRS is quite a bit more complicated than in C-band because of the interesting incumbent use cases. So technically, it's more difficult. And when we can find access to an adjacent band, 500 megahertz, we think there's a real opportunity here to create a huge swath of 5G spectrum. And that is why I think there's a lot of debate. That's why I think the term Rubik's Cube is used for C-band, is because there's a lot of policy complexity with it. Not necessarily technical complexity in our view, but policy complexity. So one of our other observations about what happens in C-band is we're really, whatever the outcome, we're very concerned about setting bad precedent. I know precedent was talked about a lot in the last panel. We do want to see a transparent process. We don't want to see perverse incentives created for future bands. We want to see incentives created for efficient use, and we want to avoid rent-seeking behavior in the future. And we want to see competition on the buy and the sell side. So we want to see, and this really, it ties into our vision of 5G, really. We want to see diverse use cases, maximum use, efficient use, diverse business models take part in 5G, and we want all Americans to see the benefits of 5G, not those just living in urban and suburban areas, but rural Americans. And again, that ties into why we want point to multi-point in the band. And I guess I'll just conclude by saying the very first panel I thought struck a terrific tone in that they talked a lot about compromise. And without getting into the specifics of the substance of what could be put on the table from Congress or otherwise, I think having a situation where stakeholders get some portion of what they're looking for and not a winner-take-all situation is essential to solving this issue.
Christina?
Yes. So I actually specifically asked to go after Michael so that I could say ditto and not have to kind of go over all of the key points he made. WISPA represents fixed wireless providers, and I'm assuming most of the room knows the fixed wireless technology, but you would then know that spectrum is kind of our number one priority, spectrum access. That's how our members actually provide that last mile service from, there may be a lot of folks may be familiar with hybrid networks where it's fiber, but that last mile where we can actually connect to largely rural American homes is that fixed wireless technology that allows for, access barring, key terrain issues, et cetera, et cetera. Spectrum access is key, and we see C-band as a key target because of, number one, it has unique propagation characteristics that allow our members to really provide their service on this band. But also, there is a lot of opportunity. I think the prior panel settled on that there was enough unused spectrum for at least our operators to use, and use in a way that doesn't interfere with the incumbents. Like we typically use a Swiss cheese analogy, where if you envision your piece of Swiss cheese, the holes are the incumbents, the earth stations, and they have their dotted plots on their piece of cheese. And the good bits in the middle, that's the unused spectrum where our guys can easily get in using a coordination technology. It doesn't even necessarily have to be SAS. It can be just an automated coordination regime that would allow our members to operate in this unused spectrum. So we see C-band as a key opportunity to deploy in rural America. If we're talking, the context is 5G. I think there's a little bit of debate, especially among our members, whether 5G is actually deployable to rural America, say today. I'm sure my colleagues would have differing opinions on that. But to whatever extent you want 5G to be made available to rural America, we believe that fixed wireless is a key technology that has to be in that array of technology solutions, toolkits, whatever you want to call it. We have to be a part of that discussion. And the way we can be a part of that discussion is primarily through spectrum access. And we could discuss more later, but again, I wanted to go after Michael because, again, the key points he highlighted are some of our key points, and just wanted to, underline the importance of having a tech-neutral approach that includes fixed wireless technology.
Steve?
So why C-band? C-band really is, at the heart of the global race to 5G. Right? It is the band that's been the focal point around the world for deploying 5G services because it is mid-band spectrum that's a good mix of propagation, coverage, and capacity. In the U.S., there's been a lot of focus on 5G and millimeter wave bands, and I think, unfortunately, 5G has been largely associated here with millimeter wave. We see as some of the early trials go out, with Verizon particularly, on their deployments, you start to get a sense of how limited the footprint is of a millimeter wave system. Millimeter wave is going to largely serve urban areas or locations where there's a lot of people congregating. To push it out into suburban and rural areas, you need spectrum that's lower band spectrum. And we've been clear, you need a mix of low band spectrum, mid band spectrum, and high band spectrum. The low band spectrum gives you the kind of broad coverage to really serve all Americans, and then to fill in to get the depth and speed that you associate with real 5G services, you need mid-band spectrum. And it's not possible to deploy that mid-band spectrum without some base of underlying low-band spectrum and have a satisfying user experience. But the low band is what really, or the mid-band is what really gives the oomph around 5G capacity and coverage. And it is certainly feasible to deploy that to very rural areas. with that, as a part of a wholesale base. And this is kind of a key opportunity for us here in the U.S. And you ask about why not 3.5 gigahertz. I mean, unfortunately, 3.5 gigahertz has been a compromise of interests. And, I think there's been a lot of progress, and, we intend to use the band. There's been a lot of focus on that band being deployed, but the reality is it's a shared band subject to preclusion by DoD uses, and it's extremely power limited, about 10% of what the kind of power that we would deploy in a wide area macro system. So if we really want to see services in true mobile services that we associate with cellular kinds of services, it's you need full power licensed spectrum, and this is it. I think that one of the challenges we have here is to make sure that there's sufficient spectrum available. And that's one of our biggest concerns around the CBA proposal, is that it is a very limited amount of spectrum from our perspective. All the carriers and others have been talking about the need for kind of 100 megahertz per carrier amounts of spectrum. So at 180 megahertz to sell, that's less than satisfying a full carrier, let alone some of the smaller carriers like Jill's members. It gets spread pretty thinly. And so I think we'll probably talk more about the process. I think we've proposed a process that we think can free up a lot more spectrum, where through an incentive auction that would change the nature of the service or the delivery of the programming. And that's really the key, I think, is how do you ensure that programming can continue to be delivered to the to the endpoints that it's serving now. It doesn't have to be through satellite. And there's fiber out there, and I think a lot more fiber than people realize. We've been, if you look at the distribution of earth stations, the high percentage is in urban areas where there's dense deployment of fiber. As you get into more rural areas, there's actually a pretty competitive market out there for fiber. We're deploying now with our 600 megahertz spectrum into areas, very rural areas where we've never operated before, and we're able to find competitive carriers of fiber and to deploy that to our cell sites to push that further out into rural areas in a very cost-effective way. And there's been a lot of talk on these panels about the need to get more broadband services out into rural areas. And I think this is actually an opportunity here that we can use to help push fiber out into these rural areas by providing funds for that, for relocating, repurposing that spectrum and moving those earth stations to fiber rather than a wireless delivery.
And Jonathan, last but not least.
Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks for putting me after Steve so I could say ditto too. Maybe I'll just put a slightly more expanded reason. But first of all, I also want to associate myself with Michael's idea that we do need consensus on here, not consensus for consensus sake, but that our goal here from an infrastructure perspective, I represent the infrastructure industry, is that for 5G, we need as much spectrum as we can get as fast as we can get it. This C-band is particularly important for reasons that I'll go into a little bit more detail, which is, we have a capacity crunch right now. Every year, our demand for data is going up by a third. It's very difficult to keep up with that. And one of the main ways we do that is more spectrum, but more spectrum isn't coming online. So let me put this in perspective. Right now, the C-band, if we were just to get 180 megahertz, and as Steve pointed out, we hope for more, but 180 megahertz would increase the spectrum available to carriers by over 30%, according to New Street Research. That's a lot of capacity at a time when we need it. And there's a global interest, as Steve pointed out, in this band range, so it's harmonized globally, so there'll be an equipment infrastructure for it, there'll be handsets. It is a place that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that also I think needs to be touched on is that C-band has a greater carrying capacity than lower bands. You always think of lower bands as being better because they propagate further, but C-band actually has a greater carrying capacity, particularly for short distances, because we can use what's called massive MIMO or beamforming in these higher frequencies, but not lower frequencies. So this additional capacity by a third is actually greater in dense urban areas where we have the greatest capacity issues going forward, and even currently in 4G as we're having issues keeping up with the growth of demand by consumers. And remember that growth in demand by consumers isn't associated necessarily with additional revenue because they're getting all-you-can-eat plans. So our industry is paying more and more for more spectrum, for more infrastructure in order to provide consumers with more bandwidth for basically the same amount of money. In other words, less dollars per megabit. So, this industry is doing great by consumers right now, and we need, in order to continue to serve their growing demand, more spectrum. And this is particularly, luscious spectrum that we need to get as quickly as we can get it.
Great. Steve, I'm going to pick on you with this first question, though I'm going to ask it of others. But we've been talking throughout the entire proceedings today about the debate of 200 or should more is more necessary. A couple of you have mentioned about the need for beyond 200 megahertz. I'm curious, for a functional 5G network in at least urban areas in America, what's a baseline minimum of what C-band needs are? How much what's the minimum amount T-Mobile needs to make C-band work in Washington, D.C. metro area? Give me a number, Steve, right now.
Wait, where's my calculator? I mean, there is no one right number, right? I mean, I think like Jonathan said, where, the demand continues to grow and there's a growing need for more and more spectrum. And we don't see an end to that right now, and 5G is going to just accelerate that. Devices get better, the capacity requirements get to be more and more, and we just see continued growth there. So, it's not what do you need for a service, it's what do you need to satisfy services in the future. And I think that, there's wide agreement in the proceeding that kind of on that order of 100 megahertz per carrier, and that's what countries around the world are looking at. It's kind of 100 megahertz per carrier as a starting point for a launching point for 5G. So I would take that as a baseline. And so if you want real competition, you need to get something north of 300 megahertz available for carriers out of this. We think that there is the potential for up to the full 500 megahertz in areas. And the plan that we've put forward is an incentive auction-based plan where, frankly, right now, and I actually appreciate all the work that the C-band Alliance has done on this issue and to study how much spectrum can be made available. But fundamentally, they keep the service intact, exactly like it is today. They just use the spectrum more efficiently. They're selling off their excess capacity, their excess spectrum that they're not using to full efficiency right now. And it's being controlled by the satellite industry. The other half of that are the earth station licensees. From our perspective, the satellites can transmit. We care about what we need to protect on the ground, and those are the earth station licensees, and they have as much right to this spectrum as the satellite licensees. So, our incentive auction would provide competition between the satellite licensees and the earth station licensees on how much spectrum they're willing to give up. And there's a lot of potential for those earth station licensees to use fiber in these areas and be well compensated for moving to fiber. And if you look at that, we do think the incentive is there to clear up to 500 megahertz. And it really is, that is a market-based approach. All fairness to Jerry and the CBA, I mean, that is a monopoly-based approach, right? They are a single entity that controls all of the spectrum, and they've put forward a plan that keeps them in control of that. And that's fair for their business, and that's what's good for their business, but it's not a market-based approach. We've proposed something that provides true competition on the reverse part of the reverse side of the auction, and then it's a transparent FCC-run auction on the forward side as well. There's price discovery with a forward auction that allows the incumbents to see what the wireless carriers are willing to pay, and then have competition to see if that meets their expectations.
Christina, I'm going to throw the same question to you because your members obviously have interest in 5G networks in rural areas. So is there a minimum amount of spectrum they would need C-band wise?
I'm going to take the same approach,
No,
the
why?
non-answer answer. Just kidding. I didn't
Yes,
mean
that's
it
fine,
in a
that's fine.
disparaging way. We would say.
You wouldn't be the first to disparage me, so.
Do you have a wife? I kid. What we've been kind of loosely calculating, depending on obviously a lot of variables, terrain issues, technology, capacity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we could see, two carriers operators operate pretty easily on 160. That's a feasible, workable number. Don't quote me on that. But that's what we've been working on.
That last statement does not hold.
Yeah. Well, I would like to attribute it to my boss. With that said, I do want to challenge kind of, my friends from T-Mobile do understand the importance of spectrum access within the concept of, deploying 5G. The problem is that you're talking about, big corporations here, right? And our guys are quite the opposite. Our average WISP has about 1,500 subscribers. That is like a township, if you will, and that the township is too strong of a definition of that. They just are not, they don't have the capital, the sophistication, the ability to actually compete against, say, a T-Mobile, Sprint, AT&T in a, auction scenario where, they're trying to get access to this premium, I think we called luscious spectrum. I'll go with this luscious.
Sounds good.
It's attractive. But this is prime spectrum because of the propagation characteristics. And also for our guys specifically, it's like a contiguous amount of bandwidth that is kind of adjacent to existing bandwidths where they already have existing technology operating, and it wouldn't take much to get them to operate on the C-band. So it's very attractive to our guys, but we have to be able to compete. So we would love a scenario where, another key note is that our guys don't typically, we did have a little CAF anomaly this last CAF auction round, or a reverse auction round, but we typically don't take subsidies. That's not the type of capital that our members use to grow their businesses. Quite frankly, they usually use credit cards, borrow from their moms, girlfriends, or boyfriends. That's kind of the capital access they have. So when we're talking about competing against a T-Mobile, we need to consider the small guys that are actually deployed today in this rural America. And the C-band would allow them to compete with gigabit speeds to the Americans who need it most. So it's important to consider these guys who are actually deployed today.
Right. Mike, I'm going to throw this to you. The word compromise has been used numerous times today. From a Google standpoint, what's a successful compromise look like that makes CBA not unhappy and makes T-Mobile not unhappy?
So I don't think I'm in a position to get into specifics there, and we have not endorsed any plan. But let me talk about the T-Mobile plan and the parts I like. It's transparent, provides incentives to clear as much as possible, provides revenue to the Treasury. The last part is important because, let's be honest, the CBA plan has a political problem. That political problem is nothing accrues to the Treasury. So I think there's a lot to like. Now, where Steve and I would disagree is probably about things like Christina mentioned, licensing, the ability to share the repack portion of the band, et cetera. But there's a lot to like there. Some of the things that Alex was talking about makes a lot of sense, right? Where everybody comes to the table and gets some portion of what they might want. Now, again, there's a lot about Alex's plan, having discussed it with him, that might preclude our support. But it would be great to see all stakeholders get a 70% solution as opposed to a winner-take-all model.
Jonathan, I'm wondering, same question to you. As we talk about compromise, from your organization's standpoint, what's compromise look like? What do you think is a compromise?
It's a great question. You know, we're kind of the arms dealer. The more spectrum, the more infrastructure, and the better it is for us. So we're, you know, fairly agnostic as to how it gets done, but we want to see it get done quickly and get done with as much spectrum as possible. And I think the way that both those things happen is, as has been indicated, there's a minimum of friction. In other words, you can't necessarily make everybody completely satisfied, but if anybody wins too much, somebody's going to be disappointed. So what is it that gets that done is really a good question. I mean, Congress is looking at this, the FCC is looking at this, and one of the reasons that I think there is a bit of friction on getting a solution is that there's so much division among the industry. I think it'd be great if stakeholders could get together and try to do everything we can to minimize the differences. There's some great ideas out there, some great proposals, all of which have their strengths, and even opponents are recognizing that the other side has strengths, you know, and yet there's so much money at stake. One of the fundamental issues is, how does the pie get divided up, and who ends up with what share? And in the end, to quote, you know, Mick Jagger, who's doing better, thank God. You know, you can't always get what you want, but you get what you need. And that's kind of the compromise that we need to get toward. It's going to be difficult, but I think we need to do it quickly.
Steve, as the street fighting man, I'm wondering, what does compromise look like from a T-Mobile? Here's the challenge I'm putting to T-Mobile. What's compromise look like as you sit here right now?
Well, so, I mean, we've put forward a plan. I'll say, you know, if we were going down to core principles that would form a compromise, it's got to be more spectrum, you know, enough spectrum that it's a significant part of the band, and a transparent process. I mean, frankly, beyond that, we're okay. You know, whether or not there's an incentive auction or some other mechanism for licensing that spectrum, as long as it's a transparent process, and that there's sufficient spectrum there, and you know, if there's a compromise that gets to that, I think those are, you know, if you go down to first principles. Is there interest or plans on talking with CBA about these kinds of things? If everybody's talking about need for compromise, when's first steps or next steps towards actual discussion of some kind of compromise plan, or does a compromise plan have to be shoehorned by the FCC? You know, I think Jonathan's point is right on target, that there's a lot of money at stake here, and you know, we're always happy to talk to any party about a productive way forward and how to move an issue forward. You know, I think we've been clear on what we've wanted out of this, and if there's room to talk with CBA, we're always happy to do that. The word, maybe second to compromise, the word tea leaves has been thrown around a lot today. And Jonathan, I'm curious from your standpoint as former FCCer, let's play the fun tea leaves game, because I love tea leaves. Pi has been pretty silent about this, aside from just a sort of broad statement of, hey, it's more important to do it right than quickly, which is, you know, incredibly controversial. Like, well, you know, the opposite being, let's do it wrong but fast. I mean, but I'm curious, how should we read that? Why has he been quiet?
Well, I think, as I indicated, you know, the lack of consensus in the industry always makes it more difficult for the FCC. I think John Noor also made this point that, you know, the FCC likes to see sort of something smooth handed to them on a silver platter they can take up and move. And here, there are vast open areas that affect parties very, very seriously. And yet, the FCC, I think, recognizes the need to get this done, and the need for more mid-band spectrum. So they're a little bit conflicted there. So you see the FCC moving toward getting things done. I think they're signaling some concerns about CBA proposal as it stands, but indicating, willingness to look at alternative proposals and to take a little bit more time. It would yield a better outcome, as you said, but I think they recognize the urgency of it too. But there's not a sort of simple solution that doesn't end up aggravating one part or the other, and there's litigation risk at the same time no matter which way you go. Because the more aggrieved parties there are, as again John indicated, the more likely you are to have serious litigation. So I think that is what is kind of holding things up. I mean, he seems vague on timing. Obviously, not going to get done in the second quarter. We hope to get something done this year. I mean, it really is something that we need to get done as quick as possible. It'd be nice to get done in the third quarter, but the way things are going, I mean, without more indication that we're sort of coalescing around something, it might take a little longer. That gives Congress, of course, an opportunity to work concurrently on trying to facilitate, I think, more industry consensus as well.
Would it be conceivable, would it help if there was a strong unified message from a number of members of Congress of here's what we'd like to see in terms of compromise? Is that what it might take to break this logjam?
Well, Congress has a great opportunity here, but only if they act fast. The concern is if Congress starts working on it, we don't want things getting held up while Congress is deliberating, ending up not delivering a solution. But on the other hand, this is something that is so important, and that there's such consensus around the fundamental idea of getting more spectrum out quickly, and the idea of generating revenue for the Treasury. You could accomplish all of the goals. You could sufficiently provide revenue for not only the Treasury, but also for the affected satellite companies, for the base stations, Earth stations. You could also provide some funding for rural broadband, which could be the glue that holds together, the Senate and helps to move things forward there. But again, I think they need the industry to come together to do that, and they could be a force where those discussions can take place, where they can force activity, but only if there's really a serious sign that there's going to be legislative activity. And I think if they could get something done, that would provide the greatest legal certainty as well. And again, it's always difficult to say Congress can get something done in this day and age, but the Commerce Committee has always been a place where there's been bipartisanship, and this is a perfect opportunity for bipartisan action. And I think it can be concurrent with the FCC. One doesn't have to stop for the other, but in the end, if the Congress is ready to step in, generate some revenue for the Treasury, provide some money for rural broadband, settle this issue, ensure that all the parties are made whole or are able to do well as a result. Maybe not as well as they'd like, but you could have perfect forum for compromise there, but only if they act quickly.
Mike, back to you. I'm curious, again, from a Google standpoint, it seems like the big worry that everybody has, the big bugaboo in the room, is timeliness. Get this done quickly. What happens if we're sitting here 18 months from now and nothing has been happening? We're still at this contretemps we're at right now. What's the practical effect on the race to 5G and American competitiveness and all of this rhetoric that's been thrown around?
Sure. I don't, to get back to an earlier statement and the premise for Race for 5G, fast is important. I don't think you maximize for speed at the expense of other public interest outcomes, other precedential outcomes, and getting this right? And to echo what was said on the first panel, I think spending another 6 to 9 months getting this right doesn't necessarily mean we're irrevocably on the path to losing the race to 5G, because there's so much that has to happen in the back end. And I can tell you, just from my experience in CBRS, how difficult it is to get chipset adoption, hardware adoption, standard set certifications. That's the real time consumer when it comes to getting spectrum out to market. So my hope and my belief is that we will not be sitting here 18 months from now and discussing this. To pick up on an earlier sentiment, I think there's a real opportunity for Congress to perhaps step in and work parallel with the FCC, make it known what the parameters of compromise might look like. Having heard some of the rhetoric coming out of Capitol Hill, I think that's more likely than not that there will be some direction given. And who crosses the finish line first, I don't know, but I think that'll be the real catalyst to getting a decent outcome.
Jonathan, you're itching to
Just like
respond.
my slight little rebuttal, you could turn that on its head and say that because of the long lead time for equipment and for handsets, we better get this done sooner rather than later, because it's going to take a while, even if we do it, in order to get that integrated into the mobile ecosystem.
Yeah, so that's a fair point. I think my point is that spending another 6 to 9 months does not set us on the path to absolute failure here, right? It's more important to get it right. It's more important to maximize for speed and a equitable public policy-friendly outcome.
And I will say, I mean, we talked about at the beginning, this is a global push on this band, right? So I think that ecosystem of devices and equipment is developing now outside of the U.S. and will be available. I must be catching my cold. So I think once we make a decision here, we can actually, deployment can happen pretty quickly to move forward.
But as a representing a major wireless provider, I'm curious from your standpoint, if we're sitting here in 2020 and we're still at the policy debate standpoint, what's that mean from a T-Mobile standpoint for deployment of 5G? How hurt or not is that kind of delay? What does speed of this realistically mean in terms of implementation?
Yeah, look, we would like this spectrum to be available now. Right?
Well, sure,
I mean, that's
and
we are
stipulated.
So we are deploying 5G equipment right now. We're doing it in our low band. We're doing millimeter wave. So getting this as that filler in the middle that really brings a lot of capacity and coverage is important. And the sooner that can happen, the better. But I do agree that we need to do it right. We kind of have an opportunity here to make sure that we're setting ourselves up down the road for a good competitive offering with enough spectrum to go around to a number of carriers out there and to set our stage for the future. And that's probably more important than rushing to an early decision that shortchanges us on what's available.
Well,
Yeah.
just one additional point. One thing that can happen very quickly, we believe, is deployment of point-to-multipoint systems. There's already an allocation there for point-to-point systems. We believe that we can coexist because of the nature of the band, the nature of these networks, coexist with incumbents, and that could be used to serve, tens of millions of Americans quickly. So.
Ditto.
Well, and Christina, to back up question-wise, your members, your prototypical 1,500 subscriber member in wherever, if we're talking about a longer time to get this C-band spectrum freed up than currently is being hoped for, does it matter so much for, say, rural carriers who are looking at trying to bridge the digital divide, but at the same time, 5G is going to be a longer implementation in those kinds of markets than in DC, for example. Does it matter so much if we're still talking in 2020? Again, my 18-month question. If we're still talking months and months from now about how to free this up, does it really affect digital divide issues for your members?
The short answer is no. Our members are deployed.
Next question.
Yeah, our members are deployed now, offering great speed broadband access to rural Americans. It's quickly deployable, the fixed wireless technology. It's cheaply deployable. Again, going back to my opening, is that the key factor here is spectrum access. So to whatever extent C-band is available to our members for spectrum access, that's the extent that it's important to us. It's relative to the access and whatever sharing regime or kind of scenario would be implemented to allow our members to access this spectrum. Within the 5G context, I don't want to take a cheap shot, but if anybody's driven through West Virginia lately and tried to make a phone call or have a business call while you're on the road, that 4G isn't there yet. So we're not particularly concerned about the impact of 5G in the areas where our members are serving, because quite frankly, right now you can't get there's no existing cell signal, period. Right now we are focusing on C-band because of those propagation characteristics that Mike highlighted for everyone, but to the extent that we're doing it anyway, we will. I mean, we prefer, co-primary license scenario, particularly through C-band. But to whatever extent our members can get access through unlicensed spectrum, which is kind of their primary entry access point now, and whatever existing licensing regimes they can operate through, they are operating well under those scenarios. It's just as the demand goes up for rural broadband, which I think if you look at the news at any given day, someone's holding a hearing on rural broadband. I think they alluded to that earlier about every day. It's a great talking point for members of Congress, for this administration. But when you get down to the dirty details of how you actually expand rural broadband access, fixed wireless is easily deployable and cheap and ready to go now. We just need that spectrum.
Steve?
Real quick, why it's so
Oh, I'm sorry,
urgent from
Jonathan,
our
I'm sorry.
perspective is, this isn't just about our industry. I care about our industry and being able to deploy quickly, but we're benefiting every other industry in the United States. The overall economic growth of the United States is dependent on this. Is that something that's well documented? So what do other countries do? The reason we want to win the race is that we develop the applications here and literally trillions in economic value by other industries, not ours. So China is expected to release 300 megahertz of spectrum in the same range shortly, 100 megahertz for each of its national operators. United Kingdom is releasing spectrum. Ireland auctioned 350 and it's 3.6. Australia set to auction 3.6. Japan is committed to release up to 500 megahertz in this range. Lithuania. I mean, are we going to start falling behind these countries? Is it really something we can just take our time and do it right? Let's do it right and do it quickly. This urgency is not just for our industry, but it's for the entire economy.
And Jonathan, sticking with you, I'm curious from an FCC standpoint, again, putting on your former FCC kind of hat. So it's fourth quarter, and Chairman Pai comes up with here's the draft, here's the draft NPRM on this sort of thing. Is this automatically a 5-0 kind of issue on the 8th floor? All the commissioners behind it, no matter what it is? Does it depend on the details? I guess I'm curious if there's an obvious ideological or political ramifications for some of these proposals versus others that might see disagreement on the 8th floor regardless of the details of the plan.
No, I don't think it's anything's ever automatically this controversial of 5-0. I think he certainly can get 3. If you listen to what the commissioners are saying, there seems to be some alignment between the majority on this, and I would hope you get unanimity, but there's been some pressure on the Hill about if he goes with a private approach, does that move the Democrats off? I'm not sure. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but you can certainly, I think, get consensus on these parts of it. And I think ultimately it's more important that they act than they necessarily get unanimity, although they should strive for unanimity.
I have other questions, but I wanted to throw it out to the audience. People have, yes, Teddy.
Why is Verizon supporting the C-band alliance, and is that why? I mean, I heard the talk about wanting transparency, and is it because? Is there a competitive issue? You also mentioned you call it a monopoly. I think what's going on, and the small satellite companies alleged exclusive conduct. And do you think there's an antitrust issue? So there's two questions. Antitrust issue, and why is Verizon supporting that?
So I'll take Verizon first. I mean, and I don't want to speak for Verizon, but certainly what they've been clear on is that they want spectrum and they want it quickly. So I think I don't think that they're wedded to any single plan. They want to they just want something that moves quickly. And from their view, right now, that would be the CBA proposal. But I don't think they've also been clear that they think more than the 180 megahertz should be available as well. So it's an imperfect plan from their perspective, but it's what moves quickly. Frankly, like Jill was talking about later, I mean, it benefits them because in an opaque process for buying that spectrum, they come out ahead, right? I mean, in a private transaction, They're the biggest player out there, so they're going to be, they're going to be well positioned to take advantage of that. But I think if there's a proposal that moves quickly and, provides that spectrum, I don't know that they're particularly wedded to any one approach.
Why they would have be well positioned? Is it because they could be limited in a spectrum auction? Why would they be less well positioned in an open, transparent auction than in a private one?
So secondary market process, you can, there are lots of levers and things that can be moved to make spectrum either more attractive or to arrange financing terms or to, change how that spectrum is licensed in a way that makes it more attractive to one party or another. Again, it's without, that's one of the nice things about an open auction is everybody knows what the rules are, they're set, and it is transparent. Everybody knows what they're going into, and it makes it, a better process to participate in. On the, my comment on the monopoly position was really that there's one entity that's holding or believes it's holding all of a single resource that's being sought. And so that they've got the ability to either limit the supply of that spectrum or sell it under conditions that are most suitable to them and have a lot of power there. And again, so that's why we've put forward the incentive auction proposal where it provides real competition on, are there other alternative delivery mechanisms like fiber that make sense, that can free up more of this spectrum, that bring others to the table on, the right combination and the right amount to make of that spectrum to make available.
Yes.
I'm going to go back to the question before about how Congress might influence the FCC and influence the process. John, I think you mentioned that the congressional avenue could run concurrently with the FCC. One didn't have to stop, allow the other to proceed. So you could explain that a little bit more, because how would Congress truly influence this process? We heard earlier from Congressman Matsui's LD. Matsui or someone else can introduce a bill. Who cares? Right? Does that really influence the FCC's view? Does it matter how many co-sponsors? How should we be thinking about congressional influence? Because we also heard from Matsui's guy that Congress is unlikely to actually try to pass a bill until after they see what the FCC does, suggesting that they sit back, wait for the FCC to act. If they proceed with the CBA's plan, then they would step in and pass some legislation to bring them back. So if you could expand on how you think Congress would really influence the process.
It's a great question. The ideal way for them to influence the process is by enacting legislation. I mean, if they could actually do that quickly without slowing it down, that would be ideal.
Do you think I'm wrong to think that that's very unlikely?
Well, it is difficult. I got to say, it's always difficult to do that. And of course, it's even more difficult if you add the idea of doing it quickly and you don't have industry consensus. Because generally, I worked in Congress for 15 years, and again, they also like to have the rough edges sanded off before they move things. Otherwise, a small minority, particularly in the Senate, could slow things down. What's interesting here is that there is sort of this ideal confluence of circumstances, which is this raises money. There's a real demand for rural broadband, and they could set aside some money for that purpose, and they could have money for the Treasury, and they could help to accommodate the needs of the satellite incumbents and earth station incumbents. And all that is rarely possible, and I think that also makes it possible for bipartisan action. So the further they can get in the process, the more influential they are, even if they can move it out of committee, if they can move it through one house or the other. And that process will also, I think, bring parties together. It forces people to start talking about what is the compromise, what are the rough edges, who's really angry about it, how do we basically tamp that down. It's a good mechanism of democracy to try to do that. And the Commerce Committees traditionally have been able to move legislation along these lines. 2012 Spectrum Act's a good example. Bipartisanship, Chairman Walden at the time was really working together with the Democrats. I think Democrats in this case in the House need to work very closely with Republicans. There is a target there, and I think the more seriously they legislate, the more seriously they start moving, the better. And the other issue on that is, in order to score this, and it's something that needs to be considered, the legislation has to be introduced or move along the process and scored before the FCC acts, potentially. Otherwise, it might not get scored by the CBO, because the CBO, if the FCC acts first, would put into their baseline that was already current law essentially, and then the ability of Congress to capture the proceeds and reallocate them would be undercut, would be actually eliminated, because any actual outlays would be an expense and subject to Budget Act points of order and actually, according to CBO, cost the Treasury. So they need to move fairly quickly if they want to get this thing scored in a way that they're able to allocate the funding and move it forward that way.
Great. And if I'm reading the clock correct, we're about out of time, but I've got time for one more question? Yes. Steve, I'm going to start with you, but I'm going to throw this to everyone. I'm curious, aside from speed, the other issue that is always talked about is, maximize of how much, the most spectrum we can get out is going to be perfect. Is, from your distinguished competition at the CBA with their 200 megahertz proposal, do you think that needle is going to move? Do you think that proposal, are we going to see more competition on the amount of spectrum side of these various rival proposals?
Well, you will if it's the incentive auction proposal, right? Because it is allows the earth stations to sell and to move to fiber, and changes the the nature of the use of that spectrum and frees it completely. And on the speed part of it, and again, I talked before. I think we think you could free up to potentially the full 500 in some areas, and we allow that variation to based on demand and what the market really requires. But on the speed issue too, I want to, there's been focus about whether CBA is the fastest way forward. I think it's the wrong, we're looking at the wrong thing if we're looking at just how quickly can you get some spectrum licensed. What we should be looking at is how quickly can you make that spectrum available for deployment. And we think that the incentive auction proposal will make more spectrum available and make it available, fully available, more quickly. Because if you are, if you're moving to fiber, Jerry talked about the need to build and launch satellites, so it's a 3-year process. Moving to fiber, particularly in these areas where it's widely available, is very quickly. So we think it's more of a 1-year transition to move to fiber. Now, it may be a little bit longer as you push into areas where fiber doesn't exist and you have to deploy it. But, again, we've got a lot of experience in deploying our network into, rural Montana where there's been no fiber, and we had, stringent build-out requirements where we had to have a network launched in 18 months, and we're running new fiber out to there.
Great. Anyone else want to touch the question of whether we're going to see, I guess, greater competition on the amount of spectrum side of these rival proposals? Mike, any thoughts on this?
I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is the legislation that is the draft legislation that's been making its rounds seems to indicate that there is a desire for more than 200 megahertz or 180 plus the guard band. So I would say, if it's left up to Congress, there's going to be more.
Cool. I thank you all for your patience and your time.